The millionaire CEO was rushing to an important meeting, until three lost little girls with his eyes stopped him cold. Blake Weston was not a man who stopped for anything. As the CEO of one of the fastest-growing investment firms on the East Coast, his life moved on a strict, almost mechanical schedule. Every minute had a purpose, every meeting was calculated, and every appearance polished. That morning was no exception. He was running slightly behind for a high-stakes investor meeting that could determine the next phase of his company's expansion, and he hated being late. His luxury black sedan rolled smoothly through the city streets as he scanned through the final draft of the presentation on his tablet. Dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit, his blonde hair neatly styled, he exuded the kind of authority and control that intimidated most people before he even spoke. He had just stepped out of the car and was heading briskly toward the glass doors of his office building when a small, hesitant voice made him stop mid-stride. "Mr." He turned his head, annoyed at the interruption, only to find three little girls standing on the sidewalk, looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. They couldn't have been older than 6 or 7. Each one wore a pale pink dress, their blonde hair pulled into matching braids, and their bright blue eyes stared at him with something that went beyond curiosity. There was a strange familiarity in their expressions, something about their faces that struck him with quiet force, but he couldn't place why. Blake glanced around, half expecting a parent to appear from a nearby car or building, but no one came. One of the girls stepped forward, clutching a worn stuffed bunny in her hands. "We're lost," she said quietly, her voice trembling just enough to make his heart twitch. The other two nodded silently beside her. "Our mommy went into the store but never came back. We waited and waited, but it's been a really long time." Everything in him screamed to delegate the situation, call someone, alert a nearby security guard, anything to keep his day on track. But something in their faces stopped him cold. The girls didn't look afraid, not exactly, but they looked like they were waiting for someone to help them. Really help them. And Blake, who hadn't spoken to a child in years, who hadn't thought of family in even longer, found himself kneeling down to their level before he realized he was moving. "Where was the store?" he asked softly, his voice losing the edge it usually carried in boardrooms. The girls pointed down the street toward a small corner grocery, its front windows plastered with faded posters. "We were sitting on the bench," one of them added. But no one came. Blake's first instinct was still to call the police, and he did, giving a brief report and promising to wait until someone arrived. But while they stood there on the sidewalk, the girls didn't shift away from him. They huddled closer. One of them reached out and took his hand without a word. Her tiny fingers curled around his, and he froze. He looked down at her, and her blue eyes locked with his. They were so familiar. Unsettlingly so. They looked like his. A strange tightness bloomed in his chest, a feeling he couldn't immediately define. His mind, trained for logic and facts, began sorting through possibilities, dismissing them almost as quickly as they formed, until he remembered a name. A name he hadn't thought of in years. Skylar. The air suddenly felt heavier. He hadn't seen her since college. She had disappeared from his life just as things between them were getting serious, leaving nothing but a short, vague message that said she needed space. He never heard from her again. At the time, he'd thrown himself deeper into work and never looked back. But now, looking into these little girls' faces, something impossible began to take shape in the back of his mind. He didn't speak the name aloud. Instead, he stood up slowly, keeping one hand gently on the shoulder of the girl still holding on to him. The police would be there soon, and maybe this would turn out to be nothing more than a strange coincidence. But as he glanced down at the three little girls, identical, lost, and far too familiar, Blake Weston had a gut feeling that nothing about this moment was ordinary. And for the first time in years, he felt his carefully ordered life shift beneath him. Blake sat alone in his office that evening, long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights shimmered through the glass walls around him, but he barely noticed them. His laptop sat untouched, and the presentation he had been preparing for weeks was now irrelevant in his mind. All he could see were those three little faces staring back at him, all wide blue eyes and soft, serious expressions that seemed too mature for their age. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that they were more than just a strange coincidence, that fate had deliberately thrown them into his path. He couldn't stop thinking about the moment one of them had taken his hand like she already knew him. He couldn't explain the way that tiny gesture had sent a ripple through everything he thought he understood about his life. After the police arrived, he had stayed with the girls until they were safely placed into temporary care. He had watched them climb into the back seat of the patrol car, one of them looking back at him through the window with the same steady gaze that haunted him now. He hadn't planned to get involved any further. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility, that his day had simply taken an unexpected turn, and now it was over. But hours later, he was still sitting there, unable to stop wondering who they were and how they had ended up alone on a street corner with no one looking for them. Eventually, he gave in to the weight in his chest. He opened his laptop, pulled up an encrypted browser, and began searching for anything related to their mother, the name one of the girls had quietly mentioned while waiting for the officers. Skylar. Just hearing it again had shaken something loose in his memory, something he had locked away long ago. She had been his first real love. Passionate, stubborn, brilliant. He remembered how she used to curl her legs under her while reading, how she laughed when he tried to cook for her, how she had whispered "I love you" for the first time in the middle of a rainstorm. And he remembered how suddenly she had disappeared. No closure. No explanation. Just gone. He had convinced himself that she left because she wanted something different, something smaller, quieter than the life he was building. But now, with those three girls in his mind, he couldn't ignore the possibility that maybe she hadn't just walked away. Maybe there had been a reason. Maybe something had happened that neither of them could have predicted. His hands trembled slightly as he dug deeper, tracking public records, birth announcements, school registrations. It took hours, but finally he found something, a listing for a woman named Skylar Jameson, living just 2 hours away in a quiet coastal town. There were no social media accounts, no photos, but a recent school enrollment form listed 3 children, Amber, Lily, and May. All 6 years old. All with her last name. Blake sat back, the air leaving his lungs slowly. He hadn't even realized he'd been holding his breath. His mind raced with questions. Could it really be true? Had Skylar been pregnant when she left him? Had she chosen to raise their children without telling him? And if so, why? Was it because she didn't trust him, or because he had been so consumed with ambition that she believed he wouldn't care? He hated the sick twist in his stomach, the realization that maybe, in chasing his career, he had missed something irreplaceable. He stood up and crossed the room, staring out at the glowing skyline, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He didn't know what he would say if he saw her again. He didn't know if she would even speak to him. But he knew with absolute clarity that he couldn't just let this go. Not this time. Not if there was even the smallest chance that those girls were his daughters. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Blake was already on the road. He had cleared his schedule, cancelled all meetings, and left his assistant with only one instruction: hold everything until further notice. As the miles passed and the city faded behind him, he felt a strange calm settle over his nerves. He wasn't thinking like a CEO anymore. He wasn't strategizing or managing outcomes. He was just a man who needed answers. A man who had looked into the eyes of 3 little girls and seen something he hadn't realized he was missing, something that felt a lot like home. The coastal town was nothing like the city Blake was used to. It was quiet, slower, with winding roads that led past rows of small shops and weathered houses that seemed to breathe with history. As he drove through it, he felt strangely out of place in his black luxury car, his tailored shirt and polished shoes a sharp contrast to the casual charm of the locals. He parked discreetly near the public library listed under Skylar's name and waited, his heart pounding harder than it had during any boardroom pitch or high-stakes negotiation. There was something deeply unnerving about facing a part of his past he had long believed closed. And yet, under all the uncertainty, he felt a sense of urgency he couldn't ignore. He didn't have a plan. He didn't even know what he expected to find. But when he saw her through the window, Skylar, arranging books at the front desk, time seemed to collapse in on itself. She looked different, of course. Her hair was longer now, darker, pulled into a loose braid down her back. Her face carried new lines of experience, but her movements were still graceful, careful, and there was a gentleness in her eyes that hadn't changed at all. He stood frozen for a moment, watching her through the glass, as if trying to convince himself she was real. Then she looked up and saw him. Their eyes met through the window, and for a moment neither of them moved. Her expression shifted slowly from confusion to recognition, and then to something sharper, shock, maybe fear. Blake stepped back instinctively as she walked quickly out the front door, shutting it behind her. She didn't approach him at first, just stood there with arms crossed, her expression wary. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low and guarded. "I saw them," he said quietly, unable to think of any better place to start. "The girls. In the city. They came up to me." Her face tightened. "You saw them? Where?" "They were alone," he continued. "They said you went into a store and didn't come back. They looked like me." Skylar looked away for a moment, as if steadying herself. "I was gone for 5 minutes," she said quietly. "And when I came out, they weren't where I left them. I thought they went back to the car. I looked everywhere. I called the police. I didn't know they had wandered so far." He nodded slowly, absorbing her words. "I didn't know you had children, Skylar. You never told me." She looked at him then, sharply. "You were gone, Blake. You left for London without a word. You changed your number. You disappeared into your career like nothing else mattered." His jaw clenched, a flash of defensiveness rising instinctively. "I didn't know you were trying to reach me." "I tried," she said, voice shaking slightly. "I wrote. I called. I was scared. I didn't even know if you'd want to be part of their lives. And by the time I got the nerve to try again, too much time had passed. I was alone, and I didn't want to reopen everything just to be pushed away." He ran a hand through his hair, the weight of her words settling heavily on his shoulders. "They're mine, aren't they?" he asked, even though he already knew the answer. She didn't reply at first, then gave a slow nod. "Yes." The word landed between them like thunder. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of gulls and distant waves filled the silence. "Why didn't you tell me later?" he asked, his voice lower, more vulnerable now. "After they were born. After the dust settled. You should have given me a chance." Skylar looked at him with tired eyes. "I was angry. I was hurt. And I was terrified. I thought if I brought you back into our lives, you'd try to take them from me. Or worse, you'd care for a while and then disappear again. I couldn't do that to them." Blake stepped closer, but gently, with no pressure. "I'm not that man anymore." "I don't know who you are," she said honestly. "I don't either," he admitted. "But I'm trying to find out. And I need to know them. I need to know my daughters." She studied him for a long time, her face unreadable. Then finally, with a sigh that sounded like surrender and strength all at once, she said, "You can see them. But you don't get to walk in and act like nothing happened. You'll have to earn it." "I will," he said without hesitation. "Whatever it takes." Skylar gave a small nod, then turned to go back inside, pausing only briefly before adding, "They'll be home from school at 3. You can come by." And with that, the door shut softly behind her, leaving Blake standing outside, breathless, stunned, and overwhelmed, but also, for the first time in a very long time, full of purpose. Blake spent the next few hours in a haze of restless pacing and silent reflection. He drove to a quiet cafe nearby and sat by the window, staring at the steam rising from his untouched coffee, trying to rehearse what he would say to 3 little girls who didn't even know they had a father. Nothing he came up with sounded right. Every sentence felt too formal, too shallow, too late. He wasn't afraid of conflict or challenge. He'd spent his adult life thriving in boardrooms full of impossible people, but this was different. This was delicate. This was personal. And for the first time in years, he felt entirely unprepared. By the time he arrived at Skylar's house, his chest was tight with nervous energy. The house itself was small and well-kept, with bright flowers lining the walkway and tiny chalk drawings still visible on the front steps. He stared at them for a moment, his heart clenching when he saw 3 names written in shaky, colorful handwriting: Amber, Lily, and May. He hadn't realized how much those names had already become part of him until now. Skylar opened the door before he could knock. She didn't smile, but she didn't look angry either. She simply stepped aside and let him in. The house smelled like something warm had been baking, cinnamon, maybe vanilla. It felt like a home, not just a place to live, and the realization that he had missed out on years of it cut sharply through his thoughts. Skylar motioned for him to sit, and he lowered himself carefully onto the couch, hands resting tensely in his lap. There was a moment of quiet, just long enough for his nerves to spike again, before he heard the sound of voices from the hallway. The girls entered the room together, each of them carrying a small book, their matching blue eyes scanning him with curiosity. They paused when they saw him, clearly recognizing him from the city. Amber, the boldest of the 3, tilted her head slightly and asked, "Are you the man from the sidewalk?" Blake smiled gently, his heart thudding hard in his chest. "Yes. I'm Blake." Lily, the more reserved one, stepped a little closer and glanced at her mother. "Why is he here?" Skylar gave a soft sigh and sat down beside them. "Girls," she said gently, "this is someone very special. His name is Blake Weston. And, he's your father." The words hung in the air for a moment, and Blake felt time slow around him. The girls stared at him, wide-eyed and silent. May, the quietest of the 3, blinked quickly like she wasn't sure she'd heard right. Amber was the first to react. She took a step forward, her little brow furrowed. "You're our real dad?" Blake nodded slowly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes. I didn't know about you until a few days ago. If I had, I never would have stayed away." Lily's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why didn't you come before?" He swallowed the ache in his throat. "Because your mom tried to reach me, and I was too focused on my work to realize what I was missing. That's not her fault. It's mine. But I'm here now. And I want to be part of your lives, if you'll let me." The room was silent again as the girls processed everything. Blake didn't rush them. He simply waited, letting them lead. Then, to his surprise, Amber walked forward and sat beside him on the couch, staring up at him like she was studying every part of his face. "You have our eyes," she said simply. He smiled, and it was the most genuine smile he'd felt in years. "I think I do." Then Lily joined her sister, sitting carefully on his other side. May followed a moment later, standing quietly in front of him. She didn't say anything, just reached out and touched his hand, small fingers wrapping around his much larger ones. The contact hit him like a wave. He had missed so much, but this moment, was real. It was happening. And it was the beginning of something he hadn't believed he would ever have. Skylar watched it all unfold from across the room, her expression unreadable but softened. She didn't say anything, didn't interrupt or guide the moment. She just let it happen. Blake looked at her over the heads of their daughters, eyes full of unspoken gratitude. There was still so much to figure out, so many conversations to have and wounds to address, but for the first time since this all began, he felt a quiet hope settling into his bones. That night, as he drove back to his hotel, Blake felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever, but also, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The silence in the car wasn't hollow. It was full. Full of their voices, their faces, their hesitant smiles. And he knew that no matter what it took, he would not walk away from this again. Blake returned the next weekend, and then again the weekend after that, until it became less of a visit and more of a rhythm, one that the girls began to expect with growing comfort and joy. Each time he arrived, he was greeted with louder hellos, tighter hugs, and more questions. Amber asked about his favorite foods, Lily wanted to know if he ever had a dog, and May liked to sit quietly next to him, pressing her shoulder against his while they read picture books. Every moment spent with them revealed a piece of himself he hadn't realized was missing, and each interaction deepened his determination to be the kind of father they deserved, even if he was years late. Skylar remained cautious but present. She never interfered, but she also didn't leave him alone with the girls entirely, as if she was still trying to protect something fragile. Blake didn't blame her. He knew trust had to be rebuilt slowly, and so he never pushed. Instead, he offered small gestures, bringing groceries without being asked, helping fix a broken step on the porch, cleaning up after dinner while the girls played. He noticed how she watched him sometimes, not with anger, but with quiet calculation, as if she was trying to measure the weight of the man he had become against the shadow of the boy who had once left her behind. One afternoon, after the girls had fallen asleep in a puppy-piled mess of blankets and stuffed animals, Blake found himself alone in the kitchen with Skylar. The house was quiet, lit only by the fading light of day through the windows. She was rinsing dishes at the sink, and he stepped beside her without a word, drying the plates she handed him. For several minutes, they worked in silence, the kind that felt natural rather than forced. It was Skylar who finally broke it. "They adore you," she said quietly, not looking at him. "Even May, and she's usually the hardest to win over." Blake smiled softly. "They're incredible. Every time I look at them, I still can't believe I missed all those years. I don't know how to make up for that." She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable but not unkind. "You can't. You just show up now. And keep showing up." "I will," he said, and the conviction in his voice was real. "I'm not going anywhere again." Skylar studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because if you hurt them, it'll break them. And I won't let that happen." "I know," he replied gently. "And I wouldn't expect you to. But I want you to believe me when I say I never meant to hurt anyone. I wasn't the best version of myself back then. I was ambitious and blind and obsessed with proving something to the world. But I've changed. I don't want success if it costs me them." She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "You're saying all the right things, Blake. But words are easy. It's what happens over time that matters." He nodded, accepting the truth of her words without defensiveness. "Then give me time." For the first time, her expression softened a little more than usual. She nodded again, and for a fleeting moment, the warmth that once lived between them flickered back to life. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was real and familiar and comforting in a way that caught them both off guard. In the weeks that followed, Blake began to integrate into the girls' daily routines. He took them to school, helped with homework, listened to bedtime stories they made up on the spot. He sat with them during thunderstorms and carried them to bed when they fell asleep in the living room. He went from being a stranger to being their dad, not just by name, but by presence, patience, and consistency. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was steady, and it was honest. One evening, as Blake tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes and asked, "Will you still be here when we wake up?" He felt a lump rise in his throat and gently brushed the hair from her forehead. "Always," he whispered. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just building a relationship with his daughters, he was building a future. Not the kind written in contracts and deals, but the kind that mattered most. And for the first time in years, he felt like he belonged exactly where he was. Blake had always believed that progress could be measured by numbers, sales targets met, partnerships signed, assets grown. But in the months that followed, he learned to measure progress in smaller, quieter ways. It was in the way Amber began calling him Dad without hesitation. It was in how Lily would reach for his hand when crossing the street. It was in the soft way May curled up beside him during movie nights, trusting him completely without needing words. He still had moments of doubt, moments when he would catch himself thinking he was too late, that he didn't deserve the place he now held in their lives. But then one of the girls would laugh or tug at his sleeve or fall asleep in his arms, and the noise in his head would quiet. This life wasn't something he could earn all at once, it had to be earned day by day, with presence and patience. Skylar noticed the changes, too. At first, she maintained her distance emotionally, always kind but never vulnerable. But over time, that wall began to wear down. It showed in the way she lingered longer at the dinner table, joining in their laughter instead of cleaning up right away. It showed in the way her eyes softened when Blake helped May practice tying her shoes, or how she smiled, almost without realizing it, when he stayed late to help the girls with a school project. One evening, after a quiet family dinner and a backyard game that left everyone breathless with laughter, Skylar joined Blake on the porch, both of them nursing cups of tea as twilight settled over the neighborhood. The air smelled faintly of summer grass and distant salt from the ocean. For a long time, they didn't speak. They just sat, side by side, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Eventually, Skylar turned to him, her voice low and honest. "I didn't expect this," she said. "I didn't think you'd really stay." Blake looked at her, his gaze steady and sure. "I didn't expect it either. But I don't want to leave. Not now. Not ever." She nodded, looking down into her mug. "It's strange. I spent so long being angry with you. And then I spent even longer trying to forget you. But now that you're here, it's hard to hold on to that anger." "I don't want your forgiveness if it's forced," Blake said carefully. "I just want you to know that I'm not here to rewrite the past. I know what I missed. I know what I cost you. I just want to be part of what's ahead." Skylar didn't reply right away, but he saw the shift in her posture, the slow letting go of something heavy. "You already are," she finally said, almost in a whisper. That night, for the first time since their separation, she invited him to stay, not just to crash on the couch, but to stay as part of the rhythm of their home. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was intimate in its own way. The kind of invitation that spoke of trust being rebuilt piece by piece. In the following days, they began to operate like a family without overthinking it. They shared school drop-offs, packed lunches together, argued gently about how much screen time the girls should have. Blake even took time off from work, a first in his adult life, to be fully present for parent-teacher meetings and the girls' weekend soccer games. His colleagues were stunned. Investors called asking questions. But Blake didn't care. For the first time, he had something worth protecting more than his title or his profit margin. And that something was the sound of 3 little girls shrieking with joy when he walked through the front door. It was the smile Skylar gave him when she saw him playing tag in the yard. It was the feeling that he was no longer passing through life but living it, moment by moment, with the people who mattered most. One night, as the girls slept and the house was wrapped in quiet, Skylar handed Blake an old photo album. It was filled with pictures he had never seen, baby photos, birthdays, first days of school. As he flipped through the pages, emotion welled in his throat. "I missed so much," he murmured. Skylar placed a hand gently on his. "But you're here now," she said, "and that matters more than anything." Blake closed the album and looked at her, not with regret, but with something deeper. It was hope, grounded in effort. Love, rebuilt through honesty. And trust, earned the hard way but held tightly now with both hands. Autumn settled over the town with the quiet grace of golden leaves and shorter days, and life inside the little house by the coast began to feel more certain. The routines that had once felt unfamiliar now came naturally: school drop-offs, bedtime routines, weekend pancake breakfasts. Blake was no longer a guest in the girls' lives. He was part of it, woven into their stories and memories like a thread that had always belonged but had taken too long to find its place. The girls had stopped asking if he would come back tomorrow. They stopped hesitating before hugging him goodnight. Now, they leaned into his arms without a second thought, whispering about school and dreams and silly things only a 6-year-old would think to say. And Blake soaked it all in with reverence, as if every moment was another piece of the life he never knew he needed. Skylar had also begun to soften in ways that surprised both of them. The walls she had so carefully built weren't crashing down, but they were quietly being dismantled with every gesture Blake made, helping with homework without being asked, doing laundry when she had a headache, keeping her favorite kind of tea stocked in the cabinet. He never tried to win her over with grand gestures. Instead, he showed up with consistency and care, letting his actions speak what his words could only promise. And Skylar, once guarded and unsure, began to let herself imagine something beyond co-parenting and shared responsibility. One evening, after the girls had gone to bed and the wind had picked up outside, Skylar found Blake in the kitchen, making hot cocoa. He was humming softly to himself, sleeves rolled up, his usually sharp appearance replaced with something quieter, more domestic. She leaned in the doorway for a moment, watching him before saying, "You look different these days." Blake glanced up, offering a small smile. "I feel different." Skylar stepped closer, accepting the mug he handed her. "I used to wonder if you'd ever slow down enough to feel anything." "I didn't know how," he admitted. "Back then, I thought emotions were a weakness. Now I realize ignoring them was the real weakness." They sat at the kitchen table, mugs warming their hands, the house silent around them except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant crash of waves. For a while, they didn't speak. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was a kind of peace they had never shared in the past, too young, too hurried, too unprepared. But now, things were different. There was history between them, and pain, but there was also forgiveness and the slow bloom of something new and fragile. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had told you back then?" Skylar asked, her voice soft but steady. "Every day," Blake said, no hesitation in his voice. "But I also know I wasn't ready then. I might have failed all of you. I probably would have." Skylar nodded, looking down at the swirling foam in her cup. "It doesn't mean it was okay." "I know," he said. "And I'll carry that regret forever. But I also know I'm not going to waste another moment." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his. "And what about us? Not just the girls. You and me." Blake held her gaze, the air between them full of unspoken truths. "I don't want to rebuild what we had. I want to build something better. If you're willing." She didn't answer right away, but she reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. It was a small touch, simple and tentative, but it carried more weight than any declaration. It was hope. It was yes, without needing the word. That night, when they stood in the doorway of the girls' bedroom, watching their daughters sleep curled up together beneath a tangle of blankets and stuffed animals, Blake slipped his arm around Skylar's waist. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. There was nothing left to say. Everything that mattered was already here, in this home, in these girls, in the quiet steadiness of two people learning how to begin again. Winter arrived softly that year, wrapping the town in a chill that crept through windows and dusted rooftops with frost, but inside the house by the coast, warmth radiated from every corner. The holidays brought the kind of chaos that only comes with 3 excitable 6-year-olds, paper snowflakes taped to every surface, flour dusted across the kitchen floor from too many baking experiments, and glitter that seemed to appear from nowhere and never fully disappear. Blake embraced it all. He wasn't just visiting anymore. He wasn't standing on the edge of their lives, waiting to be let in. He was there in the early mornings, brushing tangled hair and pouring cereal. He was there in the late nights, carrying sleepy girls to bed after movies and stories and laughter that echoed through the walls like music. He belonged there, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't want to be anywhere else. Skylar had changed too. She no longer moved through her days bracing for the next disappointment. She laughed more, her smile coming quicker, her voice lighter. She still had moments of hesitation, flashes of old wounds rising when she least expected, but Blake never rushed her past them. He was patient. He didn't try to erase the past but made space for it, acknowledging what they had lost without letting it overshadow what they were building now. Their relationship grew in quiet ways, in the way they began sharing a bed not out of convenience but out of comfort, in the way they reached for each other without thinking, in the way she sometimes looked at him with tears in her eyes and whispered, "I didn't think we'd get here." One night, while the girls were asleep and the house was wrapped in the hush of freshly fallen snow, Blake sat in the living room with Skylar, a fire crackling in the hearth. He had something in his hand, something small and simple, and he turned it over between his fingers for a long time before finally speaking. "You once said you weren't sure who I was anymore," he said quietly, his voice steady. "But I've figured it out. I'm the man who will spend the rest of his life making sure you and the girls never question how loved you are." Skylar turned to him slowly, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat as he opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver ring, simple but beautiful, exactly her style. There was no dramatic speech, no kneeling. Just truth, bare and honest. Her answer came not with words but with tears and a trembling nod as she reached forward and kissed him, a kiss that carried every second of their shared history, pain, healing, and the future they were finally choosing together. Their wedding was quiet, just the five of them on a chilly beach, wind in their hair and sand between their shoes. Amber, Lily, and May wore flower crowns they made themselves and walked down the makeshift aisle hand in hand. Skylar wore a soft cream dress and held Blake's hands like she never wanted to let go again. They exchanged vows written not to impress but to promise, promises of presence, of patience, of choosing each other every single day no matter what came. Years passed, and life shifted with the seasons. The girls grew, the house filled with books and art projects and music. There were still challenges, tough school days, sleepless nights, old scars that sometimes ached, but through it all, they held on to what they had built together. Not a perfect life, but a real one. Full of grace, full of effort, full of love. Blake no longer measured success in numbers. It was in the notes the girls left on his desk, in the way Skylar still smiled when he walked through the door, in the quiet peace of knowing that he hadn't just found a family, he had become the kind of man who would never let it slip away again. And in that simple truth, he found everything he had ever been looking for. In my opinion, the ending of this story is both deeply satisfying and emotionally earned. It doesn't rely on a grand twist or sudden transformation but instead honors the slow, painful, and beautiful process of healing. Blake's journey from a distant, work-obsessed man to a present, devoted father and partner feels authentic because it's built on quiet choices and consistent love, not dramatic gestures. The reunion with Skylar isn't about rewriting the past, it's about accepting it and choosing to build something stronger in its place. What moved me most was the idea that redemption isn't found in perfection, but in showing up every day with intention and heart. The story reminds us that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, especially when love is met with forgiveness.